Early on April 14, 2026, the Strait of Hormuz enters a far more dangerous phase. After talks in Islamabad collapse, the United States begins blockading Iranian ports. On maritime tracking screens, tanker routes are no longer just commercial traffic. They are now signals inside a live military confrontation that could move beyond anyone's control. One Chinese-owned tanker hesitates, turns back, and only later pushes through. Britain and France refuse to join the operation directly. At the same time, reports indicate that a third US carrier strike group is moving toward the CENTCOM theater. So why can a maritime blockade shake oil markets, alliance politics, and the balance of deterrence across the Middle East? Because this is no longer only about Iran. It is a test of who actually controls escalation at the world's most strategic energy chokepoint. To understand why Hormuz has become the center of this crisis, we need to go back to February 28, 2026. That was the moment the United States and Israel launched military action against Iran. From that point forward, this conflict was never only about airstrikes, missile sites, or nuclear pressure. It was also about strategic geography. And in this region, strategic geography means the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow passage between Iran and Oman carried nearly 1/5 of global oil and gas supplies before the war. When Iran tightened control over that route, Hormuz stopped being just a commercial corridor. It became an instrument of strategic coercion with global consequences. Then diplomacy failed. Over the weekend in Islamabad, US and Iranian negotiators tried to find a way to reduce tensions. They did not get there. Washington then moved from pressure to enforcement. Reuters reported earlier that CENTCOM said the blockade would take effect at 10 a.m. Washington time, or 1400 Greenwich Mean Time, and would apply to vessels traveling to or from Iranian ports across the Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. Officially, neutral transit to non-Iranian destinations would still be allowed. But that detail does not make the situation safer. It makes it more fragile. Because from that point on, the US Navy is operating in a space that is simultaneously military, legal, and political, where one warning, one interception, or one fast boat approach can suddenly change the entire trajectory of the crisis. The first hours already showed how unstable this new phase could be. On April 14th, Reuters reported that the Chinese-owned oil and chemicals tanker Rich Starry became the first vessel to pass through Hormuz after the blockade began. Earlier, it had turned back just before approaching the strait, then later resumed its course toward China. That detail matters for one reason. It shows that what is emerging is not a clean naval cordon and not a fully controlled sea lane. It is an unstable operating environment where commercial shipping, military deterrence, and political signaling are colliding in real time. Oil prices briefly fell below $100 because markets still saw some hope for dialogue. But the military risk did not fall with them. It only moved closer to the water. The alliance picture makes the backdrop even more complicated. And Britain and France have made clear that they do not want to be pulled directly into the blockade. At the same time, the war zone reports that a third US carrier strike group is heading toward the CENTCOM area of responsibility. So this is not just a blockade story. It is a blockade unfolding after failed talks, inside a weakening ceasefire, without full Allied backing, and under the shadow of a broader US force buildup. That is why Hormuz matters now more than ever. It is where stalled diplomacy, rising military pressure, and the cost of miscalculation are all converging at once. The most important development begins with a decision that may sound administrative, but is in fact unmistakably military. After the Islamabad talks broke down, Washington did not wait for another negotiation round. It shifted to coercion on the ground, or more accurately, at sea. Reuters reported that CENTCOM confirmed the blockade applies to all vessels going to or from Iranian ports in the Gulf and Gulf of Oman. Formally, this is not a total closure of Hormuz for all shipping, but in practical terms, it places the United States in a position where it must partially control maritime flows right next to Iran's operational space. That is a major shift, because from that moment on, every vessel is no longer just a civilian platform moving through a trade route. It can also become a test of resolve between two adversaries. What makes the situation even more dangerous is the ambiguity built into the mission itself. Reuters and Defense News both describe this as a large, open-ended military undertaking that could be difficult to sustain over time. The Pentagon has not fully laid out the basic operational details, including exactly how many warships will be used, what role air power will play, and how much real support might come from regional partners. That ambiguity is not a side issue. It is central to the story. Because the more uncertain the enforcement model, the more every shipping movement becomes a live question. Will the United States stop at signaling and selective control? Or will it move toward boarding, seizure, or direct use of force if it decides a ship has violated the blockade? The U.S. messaging has already been hard. Reuters reported that President Trump warned Iranian fast attack craft approaching the blockade would be eliminated. Placed next to reports of a third carrier strike group moving toward the region, the meaning is clear. Washington is not only trying to pressure Iran economically, it is also trying to construct a military deterrent strong enough to force Tehran to reconsider the cost of any move at sea. But here is the problem. Iran does not need a large conventional naval engagement to create serious disruption. It can rely on fast boats, close approaches, mines, harassment, and short, sharp actions designed to raise the U.S. cost of control without inviting a full symmetrical battle. That is why a blockade that looks simple in a political statement can become highly unstable in operational reality. So the first major development is not just that the blockade has begun. The deeper issue is that the blockade has already created a state that is part war, part maritime coercion, and part strategic signaling, where neither side truly controls the pace of escalation. The United States wants to force Iran backward without immediately opening a wider campaign. Iran wants to prove that it still has the power to threaten the world's most important energy corridor. And between those two strategic wills lies Hormuz, a place where one small tactical incident could quickly become a strategic shock. The next phase of the story is about reactions. First, Iran's response. Reuters says Tehran called the U.S. restrictions on international shipping piracy and warned that if Iranian ports were threatened, no port in the Gulf or Gulf of Oman would remain secure. That is not just rhetorical escalation for domestic audiences. It is a clear signal that Iran wants to widen the deterrence map beyond Hormuz itself and extend pressure to the ports and coastal infrastructure of the wider region. In other words, if Washington uses maritime access as a coercive tool, Tehran wants to turn the vulnerability of the Gulf's logistics network into a counter-threat. Second, there is the Allied response, and this is where the strategic picture becomes even more complex. Reuters reported that Britain and France refused to participate directly in the blockade and instead emphasized reopening the waterway through another approach. That leaves the United States in a more difficult position than the headlines might suggest. A maritime operation of this kind does not only require ships, aircraft, and surveillance. It also requires international legitimacy and burden sharing. Without that, every act of coercion becomes more expensive both militarily and politically. That is exactly why Reuters and Defense News describe the operation as major, open-ended, and hard to sustain over time. Third, the energy and market reaction came almost immediately. Reuters reported that oil moved below $100 on April 14th because markets still believed diplomacy might remain possible. But that does not mean the danger has fallen. It means markets are sending mixed signals. On one side, traders still see a path back to talks. On the other, the blockade itself has made global energy security much harder to predict. It would not take a prolonged shutdown to create serious effects. A few more days of uncertainty, a single clash, or a shift in shipping and insurance risk models could push the shock far beyond crude prices into freight costs, supply chains, and inflation expectations across multiple economies. And there is another layer that matters. The crisis is not isolated to Hormuz. Reuters also reports that Israel has continued military operations in southern Lebanon, while the United States and Israel say the Hezbollah front is not covered by the ceasefire framework Iran wants to invoke. That means the blockade is unfolding at the same time as continued combat on another connected front. So Hormuz should not be read as a self-contained maritime episode. It is part of a wider crisis architecture that includes diplomacy under stress, ongoing combat in Lebanon, tension inside the Western alliance, and a military balance in which every side is trying to prove it still holds leverage. Now here is where the deeper logic becomes visible. Why did the United States choose a blockade at this particular moment, instead of relying only on diplomacy or resuming broad airstrikes immediately? The answer is leverage. Iran may no longer have the upper hand in a conventional military sense, but it still holds one instrument that even stronger powers have to respect. It can make Hormuz feel unsafe. As long as Tehran can convince markets, shipping firms, and governments that this choke point remains unstable, it retains a form of strategic veto over the tempo of the crisis. The blockade is therefore an attempt to strip Iran of its most important remaining bargaining tool. But that creates a second problem. A blockade may look neat on a map, but in practice, it is one of the most complex forms of coercive military action. Reuters quoted experts saying this is a large military effort that may be unsustainable over the medium to long term. The reasons are obvious. Effective blockade enforcement requires persistent surveillance, target identification, interception procedures, rapid response against small craft, and rules of engagement clear enough to prevent accidental escalation. One third-country tanker, one ship suspected of having paid transit fees to Iran, or one fast boat encounter in the wrong place can instantly transform a maritime enforcement mission into a legal crisis, a diplomatic rupture, and a shooting incident all at once. That is the tactical layer. The strategic layer is even more serious. If the United States succeeds, it will not only pressure Iran economically, it will also demonstrate that it can reimpose practical control over the world's most important energy choke point, even without full Allied participation. But if it fails, or if Iran only needs to raise the cost of enforcement without fighting symmetrically, the message will be very different. It will show that even the strongest naval power in the world can be drawn into an exhausting contest inside a narrow waterway where a weaker adversary uses geography, speed, ambiguity, and asymmetric pressure to erode conventional superiority. That is why Reuters highlighted the possibility of Iranian retaliation not just against ships, but against Gulf infrastructure and other targets linked to the wider war effort. There is another deeper layer that many headlines miss. Breaking Defense reported that the Iran war is also exposing the military challenge created by commercial space-based remote sensing, to the point that Planet imposed a 14-day delay on the release of certain imagery related not only to Iran, but also nearby military bases, Gulf states, and conflict zones. That means the modern battlefield around Hormuz is no longer shaped only by ships, missiles, and aircraft. It is also shaped by sensors, data flows, and the speed at which operational information can move into the public domain. In such an environment, concealing force posture, masking intent, and preserving tactical surprise all become harder. And when tactical opacity decreases, while political tension increases, the risk that small moves will be interpreted as deliberate escalation becomes even greater. So the deepest truth of this crisis is not the blockade itself. It is the clash between two strategic logics. Washington wants to use naval power and economic pressure to deprive Iran of its strongest remaining lever. Tehran wants to show that as long as Hormuz remains unstable, every regional state and every outside power still has to account for Iranian will. That is why this is a military contest, an economic contest, a legitimacy contest, and a test of risk tolerance, all at the same time. What should we watch next? The first thing is how far the blockade is actually enforced in practice. Reuters made clear that the United States has not fully detailed how many warships will be used, what exact role air power will play, or what level of assistance might come from regional partners. That uncertainty is the first major variable. No, a blockade can sound decisive in political language, but in real operations it depends on force density, rules of engagement, and the ability to maintain pressure in a confined and dangerous maritime space. If U.S. forces are not present in enough depth to control the pace of encounters, the mission can quickly shift from deterrence to reactive crisis management. The second variable is how Iran chooses to respond. Tehran does not need a direct fleet-on-fleet confrontation. Reuters cited concerns that Iran could rely on asymmetric methods, from threatening shipping to increasing insecurity around Gulf ports and making insurance and logistics costs surge. That is what makes this dangerous. Iran does not need a total closure of Hormuz to achieve strategic effect. It only needs to convince enough ship owners, insurers, and governments that the route has become too risky to function normally. Once that confidence begins to erode, economic effects can arrive before any major naval battle ever begins. The third variable is whether diplomacy still has enough strength to keep an exit open. Reuters reported that even after the blockade began, engagement was still continuing and markets reacted positively to the possibility of further dialogue. That means the crisis has not yet sealed off a negotiated path. But that window is narrow. The more ships are challenged, the more military signaling hardens, the smaller the political space for compromise becomes. Time now is not just military time. It is diplomatic time. Every day without a clearer de-escalation framework increases the risk that a tactical encounter will trigger a strategic rupture. The fourth variable is alliance cohesion. When Britain and France refuse direct participation, that is not only a tactical disagreement, it is a larger question about who is prepared to share responsibility if the crisis drags on or worsens. If Washington has to carry most of the military and political burden by itself, the mission becomes more vulnerable to domestic pressure, energy price shocks, and any incident at sea. If, on the other hand, a serious clash forces allies to move closer to the U.S. position, then the entire alliance geometry around Hormuz could change again very quickly. And the final variable, perhaps the most dangerous of all, is how much damage one small incident can cause. A fast boat gets too close. A commercial tanker ignores a warning. An explosion at sea remains unattributed for several hours. A vessel is misidentified in a tense operating picture. In a confined waterway like Hormuz, Events like that do not need much time to become strategic crises. That is what matters most now. Not only who is stronger, but which side can control error better in an environment where error is almost guaranteed to appear. The next stage of the crisis may depend on that single question. The bottom line is this. The US decision to begin blockading Iranian ports is not simply a maritime move on a map. It marks the moment the Hormuz crisis enters a new phase, where military pressure, strategic deterrence, and global economic risk are all compressed into the same narrow waterway. Reuters shows that this is happening inside a weakening ceasefire, while diplomacy is still alive but fragile, and while the Western alliance is not fully aligned on how to proceed. That means the central question is no longer only how far Washington can pressure Tehran. The real question is whether either side can stop one of the world's most critical shipping corridors from becoming the trigger for a much wider geopolitical shock. Because once Hormuz stops being seen as a trade route and starts being treated as a battlefield of will, endurance, and credibility, every small encounter at sea carries consequences far beyond the water where it begins.